There is a story that Romans told about the books they lost. An old woman came to the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, called the Proud, the seventh and final king, who ruled until the Republic expelled him in approximately 509 BC and offered him 9 books. The books contained divine prophecies about the future of Rome. She named a price. He refused. She burned 3 of the books in front of him and offered the remaining 6 at the same price. He refused again. She burned 3 more and offered the last 3 at the full original price of 9 books. He finally bought them. The woman disappeared. The remaining 3 books were placed in a vault beneath the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, guarded by priests consulted in secret during crises, never read by ordinary Romans and never read by most senators. Only the priests had read them. For nearly 900 years, the Roman state maintained this arrangement: controlled access, institutional mediation, secrecy about the contents, until a general named Stilicho ordered them burned in approximately 405 AD, according to accounts that survive, because the prophecies were being used against his government. 6 books out of 9, then 3 more, then the last 3, 9 centuries later. The story Rome told about this is worth examining. The king who refused twice lost 6 books he could never recover. The institution that maintained the 3 remaining books for 9 centuries burned them when they became politically inconvenient. The price of prophetic knowledge in the Roman story is paid either in the moment of refusal or in the moment of suppression. Either way, most of the books burn. What remains is what the institution chose to preserve, not the prophecies themselves, but the record of the ritual instructions the prophecies prescribed. The Spanish edition of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum et Expurgatorum was published on the 17th of October, 1612 in Madrid by Luis Sanchez, under the authority of the Inquisition. The date is documented. The volume is real. It runs across more than 1,000 pages of titles, authors, passages, and annotations, sorted into categories of texts to be banned entirely, texts to be allowed with specific passages removed, and texts whose problematic sections are identified for expurgation before they circulate. Scholars have studied it for centuries. Portions of it have been digitized. It is available in archives. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum as an institution ran from 1559 to 1966, 407 years and 20 editions. In that period, every major Western philosopher had at least one work condemned. Descartes, Kant, Hume, Hobbes, Locke, Bacon, Copernicus, Galileo, Pascal, Voltaire, Rousseau, Hugo, Balzac, Zola, Sartre. The full works of some authors were banned. The logic underlying every entry was identical. There exists knowledge that ordinary people should not have direct access to. The knowledge will be managed for them by those authorized to interpret it. The specific claim the title of this script makes, that a Tartarian text predicting every subsequent war was locked away in 1612, is not supported by any historical evidence. The Index of 1612 does not list such a text. No parallel archive, no traveler's account, no record from any of the Mongol successor states that European maps labeled Tartary mention such a document. No scholar of early modern European censorship, no historian of the Mongol world, no researcher of the period has identified it. The specific text is not there. There is no evidence for it. But the year is real. The institution is real. And what the year 1612 reveals about the relationship between institutional power and prophetic knowledge is, perhaps, more disturbing than any specific suppressed text could be. Consider what Rome had understood about this relationship 1,000 years before the Index existed. The Sibylline books were consulted at moments of existential crisis. Plagues, military defeats, portents seemed to require divine interpretation. The priests consulted the books in private. They reported not the content of the prophecies, but only the ritual instructions prescribed. What rites needed to be performed, what new gods needed to be imported, What ceremonies would restore the harmony between Rome and the divine order the priests believed the books described? The prophecies themselves remained secret. The public received the ritual prescriptions. Only the priests had read them. This arrangement lasted 900 years, not because it was spiritually necessary, but because it was institutionally functional. The Senate controlled crisis response by controlling access to the text that legitimated crisis response. The Sibylline books were not a window onto the future. They were an instrument of state authority, and their power derived precisely from the restriction of access that made them unverifiable. You could not read the books and determine whether the priest's interpretation was accurate. You had to trust the institution. When the books burned in 83 BC during civil unrest, the Senate's response was immediate and revealing. Commissioners were dispatched across the Mediterranean, to Erythrae, Samos, Sicily, North Africa, to collect new prophetic verses from various oracular traditions. The replacement texts were brought back to Rome, subjected to priestly review, and those considered genuine were incorporated into the new collection. Those considered spurious were discarded. Augustus later ordered the entire private prophetic literature of Rome, more than 2,000 texts circulating outside state control, burned, keeping only the curated state version. He also transferred the books from the Temple of Jupiter to the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine, the temple associated with his own divine patronage. The centralization of oracular authority was complete. Competing prophetic voices were eliminated. Only the state-sanctioned version remained. Only the priests had read it. And then, when even that managed version became inconvenient, when opponents of Stilicho's government were using the prophecies to challenge his authority, the books were burned. The pattern runs forward from Rome without interruption. The secret history of the Mongols, the Mongol Un Nigucha Tobchyan, the foundational document of the civilization that European maps labeled Tartary, was composed in the 13th century in the years after Genghis Khan's death. Its title contains the Mongolian word for secret because the text was explicitly restricted, and only members of the imperial family and those given specific favor were permitted to read it. Soon after its composition, all copies disappeared from Mongolia. The cause of this disappearance is not known. The text survived only because Ming Dynasty scholars had transcribed it into Chinese characters as a language teaching tool, preserving the sounds of 13th century Mongolian phonetically in a medium that most people who encountered it could not interpret without specialized knowledge of both languages simultaneously. A Russian monk named Palladius, stationed at the Orthodox mission in Beijing, found a Chinese translation of the text in 1866 and translated it into Russian. The first modern language version of the secret history in centuries appeared in 1872. A modern Mongolian translation arrived in 1917. By that point, the text had been effectively unavailable to Mongolian readers for approximately 450 years. The foundational document of the civilization that occupied the geography European maps, labeled Tartaria, the text that described the rise of the greatest land empire in human history, was inaccessible to the descendants of the people it described for 4.5 centuries. It survived not because any institution chose to preserve it, but because a translation existed that had been made for administrative purposes and then forgotten in an archive. Only the priests had read it, and then even the priests were gone, and the text survived as a bureaucratic artifact in a language most people could not fully read. In 1612, the civilization that European maps labeled Tartaria was still represented on most European maps as a coherent, labeled entity. The Great Steppe territory stretched across the Eastern Hemisphere, atlas after atlas. Tartariae sive magni chami regni, the kingdom of the Great Khan, present and named. By 1817, it had disappeared from the maps entirely. In the 2 centuries between 1612 and the early 19th century, the Mongol successor states fragmented, contracted, and were absorbed into the expanding empires of Russia and China. The cartographic label that had designated half of Asia dissolved without a single dramatic event, without a mud flood, without a catastrophe that could be named. It dissolved through the ordinary process by which geographical designations become obsolete when the political entities they describe cease to exist. In 1612, the Index was performing its routine function, surveying the intellectual output of the civilization, identifying what was too dangerous for general circulation, and managing access to the remainder. The Spanish edition of that year was one of the most systematic expansions of that function in the institution's history. It is perhaps the clearest possible documentary record of what a society's relationship to dangerous knowledge looks like when it is made explicit and institutional. Perhaps the mythology's claim is simply wrong in all its particulars. There was no Tartarian prophetic text. There was no 1612 suppression. There was no document that predicted every war. The mythology is reaching for something real. The documented history of prophetic texts being controlled and destroyed, and clothing it in a specific claim that the historical record cannot support because the specific text does not appear in the record. This is the mythology's characteristic movement. It identifies a real pattern, names a real date or institution, and then projects a specific claim onto that foundation that the foundation cannot hold. The pattern it identifies is real enough to be disturbing without any invented text. Prophetic knowledge has been controlled, curated, managed, and burned when it became politically inconvenient by every major institution that had access to it across 3,000 years of documented history. What makes the honest uncertainty genuinely uncertain rather than merely dismissive is this. What was consistently suppressed was not the texts that were wrong. The Sibylline books were burned not because they were inaccurate, but because they were being used effectively. Augustus burned more than 2,000 private prophetic texts, not because they were false, but because they were competing with the state-sanctioned version. The Index did not ban bad philosophy. It banned philosophy that was powerful enough to change how people understood authority. The texts most carefully restricted were not the useless ones. They were the ones that worked. So the question the mythology is reaching for, whether a text that described the structural conditions that produce war might have been suppressed in 1612 if it had existed and been dangerous enough, is not answerable from the historical record because the specific text is not in the record. But the historical record does answer a related question. Would such a text have been suppressed if it had existed and been dangerous enough? The answer, based on 400 years of documented institutional behavior, is almost certainly yes. The institution that produced the 1612 Index operated on a simple and consistent logic. Knowledge that ordinary people can act on is knowledge that ordinary people should not have unmediated access to. The priests will read it. They will interpret it. They will tell you what ritual to perform. They will not tell you what the prophecy said. Return now to the old woman and the king. She offered 9 books. He bought 3. 6 were burned before he understood what they were worth. And the last 3 survived for 9 centuries under institutional management, consulted in secret during crises, never read by the people whose crises they were addressing, burned finally when they became an instrument against the government that had managed them. The mythology says a text was locked away in 1612. The record says that in 1612, locking texts away was the primary institutional activity of the most powerful censorship apparatus in European history, and that this apparatus operated on a logic as old as Rome, which had itself inherited it from older traditions of oracular knowledge, whose contents we cannot now reconstruct because the contents were never made public. It was read only by priests. We do not know what they read. We know what rituals they prescribed. We know how long the institution that restricted access lasted. We know how it ended. The books burn when they become dangerous to the people who control them. That is not a Tartarian prophecy. That is the most reliably documented pattern in the history of texts. The old woman burned 6 books in front of a king who did not understand what he was losing. The institution that bought the remaining 3 managed them for 9 centuries and then burned those too. What we have is what they chose to preserve, not the prophecies, the ritual instructions, not what the future holds, how to manage the consequences of not knowing. The texts that would have told us something worth knowing are ash. Only priests had read them. They are gone.